Go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for navigating cyber insurance MFA requirements. Really excited today to be co-hosting with Kirsten, CEO of Cy Insurance, and oddly enough, a distant cousin of one of our partners. Over to you, Kirsten.
Very good. Thank you for having me today. It's nice to see you.
So we'll chat a little bit about what is cyber insurance and why is it necessary. Kirsten?
Yes. Well, it's interesting. I was just at a conference this last week for self-insurance, and that's really focused in the medical space. And so I would tell people I'm in the cyber insurance field, and people still ask me, well, what is cyber insurance? Which I find, being steeped in it every day, I find it interesting that this is still considering actually a young and up and coming type of insurance. So the nature of cyber insurance is what one might think of. It's protection for breaches and for monetary loss related to data loss and other types of features really around being attacked by an adversary. But actually, it's really intended to ensure around your digital footprint. So I call it your operational digital footprint. So you can also think about cyber insurance as covering things like network downtime, accidental deletion of data. If infrastructure goes down and you have the inability to run credit cards, or there's some other larger global or infrastructure event that creates downtime for you, those things are also covered within these types of policies. So it really is very broad in terms of its coverage and capability to support financial loss related to your operational footprint in the digital space. And especially during COVID, this became very clear to a lot of organizations because they continued to pay general liability insurance, all the things that you're required to have if you have a physical office. And these are really the extensions of the elements that are outside. So it really is something that's very useful beyond what one might think of initially as what cyber insurance covers. Certainly around the data loss and ransomware areas, this is a big area of focus these days. And the other thing is that premiums are increasing tremendously around cyber insurance. And it was a very soft market, as we call it, meaning that they were easy to acquire and inexpensive. In 2017, with the NotPetya event, it created this massive change in how people viewed, or carriers and others viewed, cyber insurance, and really started to change it into a hard market, which means that it's difficult to get, that it's expensive, and that really the losses are driving the inability for people to qualify. And so this is part of what our discussion is today, which is one of the primary drivers of what is causing an organization to not qualify for cyber insurance, and something that's so necessary for business continuity, and that is multi-factor authentication. It is the number one thing that's required in insurance attestations, and the attestation is changing a lot, and we'll talk a bit more about that in terms of what people are required to do to qualify for cyber insurance, and the ongoing maintenance that people are expected to do. And so part of it is really proving that you have these controls in place and that you can reduce your exposure to potential cyber attacks.
Thanks. And as a multi-factor authentication implementer, we often get cyber insurance as a driver. So, some of our clients come to us because their cyber insurance premiums are going up so much because they haven't yet protected their assets and their data with MFA, or sometimes in the more extreme situations where they don't even qualify for that cyber insurance because they haven't yet implemented MFA. The other interesting thing is sometimes, they've been told that they need to get MFA, but they're not quite sure what they need MFA on yet.
Absolutely, and that's one of the biggest things. And we work a lot with managed service providers. And so when we say, MFA is required, everyone's like, on what, right? Because it's like, how long is a piece of string sometimes in that question. And so part of this discussion too is to help really identify like minimum implementations, broader implementations, but ways that you can use MFA to be able to qualify and maintain those right controls. And so as a minimum standard, the insurers and carriers really want to see that you have MFA installed at a minimum on email. And so, that question then becomes, what does that mean in terms of inside, outside, remote workers, et cetera? There's still a little bit of wiggle room, I think, in this next year around remote workers will still, as long as they have it, it's okay. If internal, you don't have it, that could be okay. But we are becoming settled around this policy that at an absolute minimum, every single user in an organization needs to have MFA implemented on the mailbox.
And I think it's also important to talk about why that is. You're protecting against those automated bot attacks, that you're protecting against stolen credentials, because even if someone's username and password stolen, usually their phone was not stolen with it. So you can have that second layer of protection.
And certainly also as it relates to like remote desktop capabilities, this is another area where a lot of organizations have been compromised through that, because the thing that one needs to think about is escalation of privileges in terms of how people are, the adversary is moving through laterally, moving across that network. And so MFA is a very useful tool to either slow them down or to create role-based MFA, so that then administrators particularly have the ability to push away those potential attacks.
Yeah, I think one of the things we often end up doing too is helping clients prioritize, where they should put MFA first. Because if you're in a large organization, you may have 1,000 applications. So, talking them through things like, do any of these applications have financially sensitive data or other data that would be very embarrassing if it was breached, as compared to lower lower targets.
Yes, and as we think about, like, one of the big challenges and losses in cyber insurance right now, everyone's still very concerned about ransomware, as they should be, but it's actually the after effects of ransomware that are becoming more severe for claims activity. And that's because of this risk potentially of exfiltration. So what's difficult to prove is that once someone has ransomware, and let's say you have really good backups, you have high quality backups, and you're able to replace any of the systems with the data in those systems that were locked, and so you're like, we're not paying a ransom. The question then is going through a forensic accounting to make a determination of whether there was loss of data. And that's where this is becoming a massive loss issue, because now we're having to go through a lot of breach notification requirements, because sometimes it's just unknown. The adversary took a database, we weren't sure if they were able to decrypt it. So therefore, now we're notifying of a breach and going through a whole forensic analysis of a network. And these are areas where a small level ransomware attack that was remediated might turn into a multi-million-dollar loss anyway. And so these are areas, especially around databases that have high value assets, personally identifiable information, private healthcare information, et cetera, the things you might think would be key elements that would require a notification of a breach. Those need to be encrypted if at all possible, but absolutely positively have MFA installed, so that escalation of privilege issue where credentials are compromised, that we're able to stop it there and not have to deal with that breach notification concern.
Do you have any numbers around the cost for those notifications? I've heard $200 US a notification thrown out a few times.
Yes, I mean, you have like the low level $19.99, because that's like the initial cost to do the roundup of the data, to get everything printed, to send it off. But then you have credit monitoring, potentially depends on the length of credit monitoring, and that's determined on the type of breach, the type of data that was compromised. That can be upwards of 3 to 5 years that you have to provide that amount of credit monitoring. So when it's all said and done, that could end up being, yes, $200 per record potentially. And so, especially as it relates to healthcare data, and particularly in the United States, we not only have federal standards, but also the states are starting to mirror some of the GDPR requirements, which means that there are minimum damages, even if you're like a small healthcare practice, as an example. So there will be a loss for an entity, no matter the size. It used to be that smaller organizations could be potentially exempted, but that's no longer the case. And like in New York, we have the SHIELD Act, which is very interesting, because the Attorney General has the right to audit anyone's network, even if there hasn't been a breach. And if they find that you're not in compliance with the requirements of the SHIELD Act, you can be fined. So those are other concerns.
So what I'm hearing is the cost of a breach outweighs the cost of a project proactively to implement MFA.
Absolutely, absolutely. I believe that Mar had a question as well. So reputational damage of an attack, absolutely. And that's, that's something that's also covered in insurance policies, which is reputational harm. And there's actually an accounting methodology by which we can determine financial loss of a reputational damage, so that if you lose over time users or customers because of that incident, that can be remunerated, but certainly you still have reputational harm that just can impact a brand tremendously. And really the trust issue as it relates to especially healthcare, we have seen in this past year in the US, a number of healthcare organizations that simply went out of business after a ransom attack because either they couldn't get the records back, or their damage, they had such massive reputational damage that they just simply couldn't recover.
That's a huge cost. But even with the huge cost, there are organizations that still run into problems implementing MFA. Specifically, as we've kind of chatted about, they don't know how to prioritize what systems should get the MFA, and this is where an implementer can really assist you, because they typically have a methodology for prioritizing, if you should do email first or your RDP, or identifying systems that have financially sensitive data or personal data or healthcare data. Also the resources within the organization, just not having the cycles to implement MFA, since it's typically a project, and doing a project means taking people off of their regular duties. So again, that's where an implementer can really assist you to start off your MFA project. I also run into a lot of concerns about users adopting MFA. In our practice, we work with a lot of credit unions, which tend to have older customers. And often the resistance we get is they're like, well, we're not sure if our users will accept MFA. My response to that is usually they'll accept that more than $100,000 missing and having to call you and ask for it back.
Indeed. We don't want to be as I was saying earlier, the business prevention unit, but so being able to have a simplified methodology for MFA does really help. And it isn't an extraordinary lift, but certainly the overall prioritization of many of these items is something that's challenging in security organizations. And so that is one of the key points, is how do we start? And if you only do 3 things, do these 3 things.
And just like to mention, if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'd like this to be discussional, so feel free to ask any questions you have. In terms of recommended solutions, we do recommend prioritizing those integrations by risk level, and that's where an integrator can assist you in determining the risk level. Keeping it simple by using the same MFA across online, mobile, RDP, and your call center. And what I mean by this, I often see organizations that will literally have multiple identity solutions. They'll maybe use Google Authenticator here and a text notification there. And then on their help desk, they're asking people security questions. Really just keep it simple. Pick one factor of authentication that you're always going to use, whether it's push notification or texted notification, and you can use that in your help desk. You can use that in your online, your mobile, your RDP. And that way it actually enhances your brand because you're using the same unified experience. We can address the user adaptation issues by providing user guides and clear communication. We also tend to provide a lot of videos now because people like to look on YouTube for how to do things. And that really helps with the user adoption. So it's all about communication. If you do have some users that you think are going to struggle a bit more, consider, having some white glove support. Using their administrative assistants to give them a hand, those sorts of things. So next we'll take a look at how to prioritize your MFA integrations from an insurance perspective.
Yes, so RDP is really the key one, because what we have seen, especially in the managed services environment for both users and the organizations, the provider themselves, this has been where we have seen a lot of supply chain type attacks. So if you think about the things that you've read in the newspaper over time in terms of these massive losses, it was because what happens is they credential stuff in an RDP. And the real challenge with this is that the hacker can actually automate this particular feature. So they can harvest 1 million, 2 million credentials. It's like having a gigantic keychain, and they can just continue to push against and try all those keys in an automated fashion until the door unlocks. So being able to have MFA on RDPs specifically is extremely important, because it really reduces the opportunity for someone to break through and then have a persistent supply chain attack or lateral movement, which means that you can just continually move across the organization once those credentials have unlocked that organization to be able to steal data and also just collect in reconnaissance. And so what we have also seen through cloud apps in other organizations is that other types of tools is that the bad guy will go and actually sit on the network, and they'll monitor the types of communications, they'll monitor around banking transactions. So they'll be able to actually go and change banking credentials, lock people out of their accounts, and then have a ransom attack. So they learn how people talk to each other. And so this is that lateral movement concern, and that really dials down that risk tremendously across different types of applications, as well as RDP, email, and critical databases. And then in terms of like help desk and the on-prem apps, Tracey, could you speak a bit about how that implementation, like the sort of outside-in risks, are mitigated from that particular orientation?
Absolutely. So the reason we do those after the cloud apps is the on-prem apps typically have a firewall or other controls in front of them, whereas your cloud apps are wide open to anyone. And the help desk and the call center are sort of up and coming. So what we're seeing as fraudsters are locked out of online and mobile applications because MFA has been implemented, they're going for the easy target of the call center, because call centers are typically only protected with security questions. So instead, you can extend your OKTA or your Active Directory or whichever MFA tool you're using and have them send a push notification to the caller's cell phone. So a much more secure way of authenticating them, and also a much easier user experience. I know I always hate having to call my bank call center and having them ask me 3 or 4 security questions. Ultimately, there's like one I don't know about myself, which is always annoying. It's also very frustrating for older callers or callers with memory issues who may actually forget information about themselves, which I guess I'm now in that category. So saving them that embarrassment and just making it simple for them to authenticate with one user-friendly factor of authentication. So chat a little bit about MFA specifically on RDP, because that is such a sweet target. Typically you may have weak user credentials, reused user credentials. Everyone hates passwords, so typically we have the same password on multiple servers. In terms of if you're implementing this with OKTA, which is typically the solution that we implement, it's a solution called Advanced Server Access at one of the OKTA SKUs. So essentially that extends your OKTA MFA profile over to your RDP session and secures that session. Do you have anything to add from an insurance perspective, Kirsten?
Yes, and again, like we just talked about, the credential issue is a very significant one. Just yesterday, we were going through some hacker chatter and just reviewing against the deployments we have with our insurers. And with one organization, it's a fairly large organization, but they had actively 79 username passwords for internal credentials that were for sale on the black market. And so, and these were active, having just been harvested within probably the last 30 days. So, and when we can actually see them in the clear, meaning we can actually read the username and the passwords. So as we look at trying to help support organizations and say, and we're not sure how those actually got stolen. So those are the reasons why being able to really track those credentials and have also frequent resets of passwords in addition to the MFA component is really, really key, because they're just able to get this information in very broadly. And so the question is, how do we go about identifying compromised credentials? There are a couple of ways of identifying them. One is that you might have notifications coming from different organizations like a bank or like through credit cards that if your individual credentials have been stolen. We actually work with a couple of organizations who scan, they do a lot of scanning to look at black markets, underground repositories, and we use a company called Darkbeam and a company called Synergy that's actually able to identify not only the credentials that are out there floating in the universe, but also ones that are active versus ones that have been remediated. Because it can get very noisy. I'm sure if you have them personal and you've been notified probably 100 times by this time that your username and password has been stolen or as part of some sort of data breach. We have different solutions where we can look at that from a corporate level, and it also identifies how that was taken. So potentially it was taken from, some organization being compromised, and it can point to the 4 or 5 different areas where that credential may have been taken. So usually in those incidents, when we see more than 4 or 5 starting to percolate out there in the dark net, we'll recommend a full reset of an organization's passwords, and then make sure that we're tying MFA so that if there is someone in reconnaissance, that they don't have the ability to re-steal those credentials. And that, of course, not to belabor the, why it's so important, but those things go hand in hand to be able to mitigate against those risks.
And we're also seeing a lot of companies moving away from passwords altogether, which doesn't mean you're moving away from MFA, because you can still have 2 factors of authentication. But because, username and password are just so easily stolen, moving to factors that are less easily stolen because they involve something you have, typically, a phone or a hard token.
Tracey, this is Simon. Just a quick comment there. I must say, when we speak to prospects, there's a lot of frustration in the sense that when they adopt a solution like ours, they're expecting an even bigger break on their premiums because they're adopting passwordless. My understanding right now is it's you either meet the MFA requirements or you don't. And do you know if and when we should expect to see in the industry preferred rates and a recognition and understanding that newer technologies materially reduce the risk of cyber insurance issues, and that will reflect to the consumers, that the enterprises buying into the insurance policies?
It's a great question. And what we are seeing right now, especially around the MFA question, is it's like minimum viable product. That's the minimum that you can qualify. And so in some ways, when you think of limited implementation of MFA, I call it the cyber seatbelt, right? It's like everyone has to wear their seatbelt. You don't get credit on your insurance for wearing a seatbelt because it is the base entry point. But you are right. I mean, there are other components that really, wearing your seatbelt does one thing, having airbags does another thing. And so these are things that we're trying to push in the insurance market to help people realize, the carriers realize that it dramatically reduces exposure. And we're, to kind of continue on the car analogy, the challenge we have is that we see totals and very few fender benders in the cyber world, right? And so I think part of what we can do to help reduce that exposure is to continually show organizations and efficacy of that solution where you can demonstrate reduction of frequency and reduction of severity. And so I think that as more data percolates into this environment, and we're really shy on incident data, and by incident data, I mean really looking at how many times someone tries to crack into an organization and is pushed away because MFA turned on. Our ability to measure that and show carriers, look, these organizations are actually pushing away an attacker, and it's working effectively. And so that as they compare it to the types of claims they're getting, we can have that normalized data set that actually is able to prove the delta between those 2 points. Because what we have a lot of is claims data. What we have a little of, or very, very little of, is how many times we prevented something from actually happening. And so I think that our ability to drive that data back to the carrier is what will start to soften that portion of giving discounts and incentivizing people to go exactly in the direction you just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree 100%. The only problem is very few companies, if any, will readily raise their hands and tout the fact that, you know, they were subject to attacks and they were hit, they weren't hit, and nobody wants the attention. And it's a real problem. I mean, we know of customers of our own stuff who've come to us and said, you know, the machines or the systems that were protected with passwordless were immune from the attacks. The others weren't. But you then ask them to go on record. It's like, no, why would I do that? That's not, you know, unnecessary, unwanted attention, and it doesn't make me look good. Whether, you know, it's just not something that people want to shy away from that and keep it to the dark corners of the room.
It's true, and the challenge is I think this is slowly changing. I mean, I've been in cybersecurity for almost 17 years, and for a long time, the zero conversation is what drives a lot of that mindset. We just can't, zero happens, and it's like, yeah, but people get attacked literally thousands of times a day, and that's just because that's the nature of the adversary. And so I think that, you know, there aren't zero car crashes or zero house fires. And so we need to be more realistic and accepting that the cyber attacks will happen or attacks will happen, but our ability to recover from them is really what makes us good at what we do. And I think we have to support the security professionals in driving the message that part of my job as a security professional is to reduce impact of events or to mitigate them as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, and it does kind of remind me how in auto insurance, you know, you get credit for having more in your seatbelt, but not, you know, extra credit for also having an airbag and all of the other things that you can do to reduce your risk.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to go sort of beyond insurance. So obviously, you know, insurance is an important driver, but shouldn't be the only reason that you're looking to implement multi-factor authentication. There's a multitude of additional benefits, you know, the biggest of which in my mind is increasing trust from your customers. So, you know, for example, if I'm shopping for a new financial institution, I will not go to one that does not have MFA because I don't trust them to keep my money safe. You know, reducing risk for your own organization, and of course the NIST compliance. So, you know, NIST for, has it been like 10 years, has been, you know, touting MFA and moving away from low trust factors like security questions, and still we have, you know, most organizations using security questions or nothing at all to secure your data.
Yes, and one, you know, I've heard people talk about this particularly, it's onerous, it's difficult to implement. The thing that I think is nice is that continually NIST has pushed new versions that are simpler. When we look at the small business implementation, they actually have a solution where the small business can walk through a simplified version of the 53A, which is the primary one that they have. And so there are ways that people can get to NIST compliance and implementations much more simply. I used to do them probably about 10 years ago, and, you know, I have a big, huge 3-ring binder that I have to drag around with me everywhere. So it has gotten much easier and really it helps people get the basic controls in place in a much more effective manner.
And, you know, just protecting those vulnerable customers. You know, we see every time I go to the news, basically, you know, some bank or financial institution or healthcare institution has been breached because customers are vulnerable. You know, we were chatting earlier before we started about, you know, people we've known in our lives. For example, I've got a friend who's a senior citizen, and he had someone contact him saying they were going to help him invest in Bitcoin, and, you know, got access to his computer, stole his username and password, and over a period of, you know, 6 months, took money out of his bank, which his bank did not refund because they said, you know, it was his fault for not reporting it quickly enough. But if only his bank had had MFA, the fraudster wouldn't have even had that option. Any stories from the insurance side?
Well, I mean, there are lots of them. I would say that the most recent one is that there's a healthcare organization that had a cyber claim, and that was lost money because someone claimed that they needed to send them a wire, so they sent them a wire. Part of that was the requirement to have an MFA implementation. The insurance company paid. Then when they did the investigation, discovered that they didn't have MFA in place, nor did they have the dual authentication, meaning that there were 2 people required to authorize a wire. And so they actually sued that organization to get the money back. So there's real enforcement now that's coming around these types of implementations. There is investigation to ensure that the implementations were completed. And certainly it's not that, because people will say, oh, cyber insurance doesn't pay, they pay, but you have to do your share. And so they're becoming much more vigilant around investigations on these points.
And then kind of back to the user experience, I think it's important to have a unified verification experience. So having the same factor of authentication across your online, your mobile, and your call center, and even your chat bots. So we're working with a company right now to use their push notification to their phone as an authentication method to their chat bot, which will allow them to share more data, such as their bank balances over the chat bot. Really enhances your brand, as well as just so much easier for your customers and users if you're using the same factors of authentication across all interfaces. And wrapping up, if you do have any additional questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat or feel free to reach out to myself or Kirsten directly. Here's our contact information. Any final words, Kirsten?
Yes, well, Garrett just asked a question about the usernames and compromised usernames and passwords. So he's asking if there are any recommendations for MFA or shared accounts that may seem to tie to MFA directly to a single device. Tracey, do you have some thoughts around the MFA component of it?
Yeah, the shared accounts is pretty challenging. Obviously, we'd always recommend to not have shared accounts. There are factors of authentication that will work with a shared account, such as a email verification to a shared email. But again, those are lower security and should only be used in, maybe a low risk retail situation or something that's not a high value target.
Yeah, that is one of the concerns, and it's difficult in those instances. So they can be boundaried. There's also, like when we talk about like even typing DNA, they have that solution where if, like, for example, you're in a reception for healthcare or others, that there could be 2 or 3 people who are authenticated to that particular machine. It's a voice, not voice, it's a face authentication. So that's another way that there are some other solutions like typing DNA that where you can have multiple people using this as like a workstation as an example.
Yeah, and typing DNA is such a great example, and that it doesn't require any sort of download from the user, so it's really customer friendly because it authenticates you with your typing biometric.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions?
Can you get the slides? I'm sure we can send the slides.
Yeah, of course. So thank you very much, and feel free to reach out in the future.
Yes, well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for having me, Tracey. It was great to spend time with you today.
Great to have you, Kirsten.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Be safe, everyone.
Bye.